Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good week. Today, we are going to be continuing our final topical lecture for our Jesus and the Gospels course. Um, Today, we'll be looking at non-canonical Gospels, often also referred to as Gnostic Gospels, apocryphal Gospels. We're all talking about all the same thing when we talk about those. So we've spent most of our time looking at the Gospel of Mark this semester together. We've talked about Matthew, Luke, and John as well, the four canonical Gospels. Of course, within that, we have the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, as well, has a different feel to it. He's not part of that synoptic group. Um, but outside of these four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it is not as if all storytelling and writing about Jesus and the life of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus stopped as soon as John the evangelist put down his pen at the end of his gospel. What we see for the next few centuries is gospel writing really continues. It's sort of explodes, comes onto the scene. Many people have stories they want to tell about Jesus, and some of these gospels that are outside of the four canonical gospels are really popular in the early church. We'll see a little bit of that today. So there's a bunch of these. We're not going to look at all of them or think about all of them. We are going to consider three of these gospel texts today. And of course, when we talk about non-canonical gospels, they don't all look or sound like the four that we have in the New Testament. So when I say these, I'm referring to texts, we call them the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter, for example. And there are a bunch of these texts, and they're not sort of like a unified group. It's not as if one community was writing all of these texts, or that, some people were deliberately planning to subvert the four canonical gospels or offer an alternative Christianity. Um, Instead, if you think your way into the second century, for example, um, and you know the late second century, and you have these texts, which maybe by then are starting to circulate with the titles Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Um, it's not entirely clear that you should not be writing more of your own, right? Um, we do get warnings in Scripture about adding to it or subtracting. Think about Deuteronomy. We get that many times. The book of Revelation, towards the end there, has similar warnings. But um, you know, think about the end of John's gospel, where John says, Jesus did many, he said and did many other things, um, which are not recorded here. And I suppose if somebody did, take the time to record all of that, not all the books in the world could contain Jesus's life and the things he did. Similarly, at the beginning of Luke's gospel, um, in Luke 1, 1 to 4, we hear that, others have taken it upon themselves to write accounts of the life of Jesus, and Luke wants to write an orderly account for Theophilus. But he doesn't say who he's talking about. He doesn't say that he's talking about Matthew and Mark, although I think that's probably who he's referring to. He could also be referring to others as well that have not survived. But if you're an early Christian reading that from Luke's prologue, and you read the end of John's Gospel, it seems that some early Christians read those texts almost as invitations to write um, gospel-like texts about Jesus. And so we get a lot of really interesting material that comes up. It's hard to pin down exactly where these traditions begin, especially some of the ones we'll see today. They're really bizarre. Um, and it can be easy for us to demonize the authors of these texts. thinking that, especially we'll see the Gospel of Peter today. The Gospel of Peter is a resurrection account, crucifixion and resurrection. And it has a giant Jesus, like physically giant, his head reaches the sky. And at the resurrection, the cross speaks, like the wooden cross speaks. And it's easy to see that sort of text um, and say, man, this must be heretical groups, people who hate the truth of the gospel, stuff like that. But I think, if we try to, again, think our way back into these people's shoes in the early centuries, it's not as if, especially before we have written creeds, and the canonization process of Scripture, as difficult as it is to tell exactly how and when that took place, um, some of these texts were being written before the invention of the codex. Remember, technology is actually really important here in the canonization of the New Testament and the Bible, because we have scrolls, right? And you can have like a library of scrolls, and you can keep scrolls in a room. But once we get the invention and the rise of the use of the codex, and a codex is, you can stack pages on top of each other and bind them together. And this really increases the amount of material that you can put all in one volume, right? On a scroll, you can only have a scroll that's so long. But in a codex, you can essentially just keep stacking it up much, much, much larger. And so we get these great codices, the plural of codex, um, third and fourth century codices of the entire New Testament, for example, in one volume. And for us as modern people who have books, if you look around me, there's books all behind me. These are codices, plural codex, pages stacked on top of each other and then bound with a binding. Um, if I mean that technology has so shaped our view of canonization and what is in and what is out. If you are living in the second century, and you're not in a community that's using codex in order to contain your scriptures, and you just have collections of scrolls or some other book technology which is not a codex, um, you probably ask the question about canon and about what counts in a different way. Like once we have the codex, the book, it we can ask the question about what is scripture in a new way. That does get closed, maybe much more strongly than it did before. You can have a book, a codex with 26 to 27 of our New Testament books. Revelation has a difficult time getting in at points. But, once those are bound under one volume, we get much more firm ideas about which books count as scripture. Um, and there's not always universal agreement in the first few centuries, but at least that's starting to crystallize in a way that it probably wasn't before this book technology really took off. And so these people, um, you're reading the end of John's gospel, seeing that there are things that Jesus said and did which were not written down in John, and alleged apparently not in the other three canonical gospels. And remember, it's not entirely clear to people this distinction that we have of canonical versus non-canonical. Well, I mean, if you're living in the second century, and maybe you only have access to the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Luke or something. Um, this whole idea of canonical versus non-canonical gospels, it's it's a little bit anachronistic to say that people would have been asking the question the same way. Um, the fourfold gospel collection, does really crystallize, especially with figures like Irenaeus. Sorry about that. Um, he talks about the fourfold gospel collection, Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John. Um, but it from a very like rigidly historical perspective, it wasn't clear at the time that it had to crystallize just that way. So these people, I do think, there's heresy in these gospels, but the people who were producing these, which is really hard to tell who that was. I think largely they thought they were participating in this gospel writing tradition of authors like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what they tend to do, this isn't a universal rule, but often they tend to see these little gaps in the Gospels or in Acts, and they expand, they fill them in. This happens in Second Temple Jewish literature as well. The book First Enoch, chapters 1 through 36, is a sort of expansion of the Genesis 6, 1 through 4, this strange story, and this little bit gets expanded out in new ways. So the gospel of the infancy gospel of Thomas, as we'll see in a minute, takes Luke chapter 2, mentions boy Jesus. Remember, he's 12 years old at the temple, and he has this episode where he's escapes his parents, and they leave Jerusalem without him. Well, uh, the infancy gospel of Thomas is really interested in that time period, which in the other four canonical gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus as a child really does not get any attention at all outside of the birth stories in Matthew and Luke, and this little bit in Luke. Similarly, there's a book called the Acts of Thomas, just like we have the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament. And if you think about it, the way that the book of Acts in the New Testament unfolds, um, you get Jesus in chapter 1, and you get the 11, and they replace Judas with Matthias, and so we've got 12 disciples, 12 apostles again. And the story really narrows in on, Peter and James and what they're up to. And then for the back half of the book, it sort of shifts gears to Paul. But Jesus says to his disciples in Acts 1:8, "You will be my witnesses to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And other than sort of our like big hitter disciples, Peter and James in particular, the others sort of fall off the map. They really don't show up again in the story. Thomas, though, uh, this provides fertile ground. There's a tradition in early Christianity that Thomas, throughout the narrative of Acts, while all of that is going on, makes his way to India. And he goes and he brings the gospel to India. And you should take the time to go read that. It's fascinating stories and how those are told. The Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Thomas is one of my favorites. I haven't read it in a couple years. It is a masterfully told story. These are not, willy-nilly thrown together. This is brilliant storytelling that happens in the Acts of Thomas. So go and check that out. But it works because in the Acts of the Apostles, we just don't hear about Thomas. And then there's this early tradition that he goes to India. And so for the Acts of Thomas, it makes sense to have him follow his journey doing that whole thing. So I think that's all I want to say there by way of introduction. We get these non-canonical gospel texts. Let's look at a few of them. First, let's look at the infancy gospel of Thomas. Let me share my screen. All right. Infancy Gospel of Thomas. This one is really interesting. It follows, again, that bit in Luke where it talks about Jesus as a child. And it tells some really interesting stories. You have this PDF on your Canvas page, just a heads up. So go ahead, actually, at this point, and read the three PDFs, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of Peter. Read those, take notes on them, and think as you're reading where these connect and where they differ from the four canonical Gospels. And then go back to this video and just keep watching. So look at this introduction here in verse 1. I, Thomas, this is an introduction from the author. I, Thomas, an Israelite, write you this account, that all the brethren from among the heathen may know the miracles of our Lord Jesus Christ in his infancy, which he did after his birth in our country. The beginning of it is as follows. Okay, so the author here identifies himself as Thomas, an Israelite. Thomas, supposedly one of the 12. Now, as far as the names that get attached to these canonical gospels, um, Thomas, Peter, Judas, um, Mary, uh, these, if we think about why certain names get attached, it's because, um, are you familiar with the word clout? This word sort of made a comeback a few years ago. But if you want clout, you want people to um, respect your reputation. You want to have a good reputation. One way that ancient authors could really ride somebody else's clout, they could just write under the name of somebody else. So we'll go back to First Enoch again. Um, First Enoch probably written around the third to second century BC. It's pretty hard to date, and it's five different books which were composed at different times, but probably in that window, the third to first century BC. In the Gospel, the book of Enoch, First Enoch, claims to be written by Enoch. We remember this chapter from this character from Genesis, this guy who was taken up to be with God. So, I mean, if you think about the big picture of the biblical narrative, Enoch is very early in the early chapters of Genesis. First Enoch is for sure written sometime like third to first century BC. Chronologically, this work we know for sure comes centuries and centuries after the figure of Enoch lives in the book of Genesis. But whoever singular person or community produced the book of Enoch, they wrote under the name of Enoch because it gave them a certain kind of authorial authority. So to write in the name of Enoch gave them a certain level of clout. Um, and probably the early readers of First Enoch didn't think that Enoch actually wrote the book. Um, but it was sort of in this like tradition of the figure of Enoch. I'm not so certain whether these gospel early readers of the non-canonical gospels, if readers would have thought Thomas actually wrote this, I think there's a good chance they would have thought that. We'll actually see that with the Gospel of Peter in a minute. Um, but all that to say, some of the big players in the New Testament figures are sort of taken at this point. Matthew, John is a big one. You're probably not going to write a, companion to the Gospel of John. Um, Although we do get some interesting Nag Hammadi texts that claim the name of John. Um, but you want to like have a figure within the New Testament who is prominent enough that they count as an apostle or somebody very close to Jesus. So this person chooses Thomas. Um, Here. I, Thomas, an Israelite, write this account about Jesus from his infancy. So let's look at a couple of these stories because they are fascinating. All right, let's read, verse 2, this long verse. The child Jesus, when he was 5 years old, he was playing in the ford of a of a mountain stream. And he collected the flowing waters into these little pools and made them clear immediately. He, by a word alone, he made them obey him. Okay. Uh, 5-year-old Jesus doing this. And having made some soft clay, he fashioned out of it 12 sparrows. So Jesus takes some of the clay from this little pool, 5-year-old Jesus here, and he molds these 12 little sparrows. And it was the Sabbath when he did these things. Okay. and there were also many other children playing with him. A certain Jew, seeing what he was doing, went off immediately and told Joseph, "Look, your son is at the stream, and he's taken clay, made it into 12 birds. He has profaned the Sabbath." Think about our discussion last week with um, Jesus and Torah observance. Does Jesus profane the Sabbath in the Canonical Gospels? Here we have another similar Sabbath controversy. Think of Jesus in the Synoptics plucking his disciples plucking grain on the Sabbath, or Jesus healing on the Sabbath. And Joseph, coming to the place and seeing, cried out to him, saying, "Why do you do on the Sabbath that which is not lawful to do?" This is the same question from the Pharisees at the beginning of Mark chapter 3. Interesting. Might be some borrowing going on here. And Jesus, here we go, clapped his hands and cried out to the sparrows and said to them, "Off you go." And the sparrows flew and went off crying. And the Jews, seeing this, were amazed and went away and reported to their chief men what they had seen Jesus doing. So here, um, this infancy gospel of Thomas is providing a little story about Jesus as a 5-year-old boy, and he molds these clay pigeons, sparrows, on the Sabbath. This is a Sabbath controversy story. Uh, and he claps his hands, and these turn into real birds, and they fly away. Um, Fascinating, really, really interesting. It has the form of a story from the Synoptic Gospels, as far as somebody approaching and saying this is not lawful, and then people being amazed at the end of the miracle, and then reporting what Jesus had been doing. It has the shape of many of Jesus's miracle stories in the Gospels, but it's about when Jesus is a child. How about this one, verse 4? After that, all the stuff that happens in verse 3, where uh, yeah, let's actually look at verse 3. The son of Annas, the scribe, was standing there with Joseph. He took a willow branch and let out the waters which Jesus had collected. So remember, back here, Jesus had collected these little pools of water. Jesus, seeing what he had done, was angry and said to him, "O wicked, impious, and foolish, what harm did the pools and the waters do to you? Behold, even now you shall be dried up like a tree." Okay, when the man in the Gospels has the withered hand, very woodenly, his hand is dry, withered, dry. It's shriveled up like something like a dry plant. You shall not bring forth either leaves or root or fruit. And back to the narration, straight away that boy was quite dried up. Um, And so Jesus, sort of like the way he shrivels up the fig tree in Mark chapter 13, he curses this other child here, and he gets shriveled up. Probably something like paralyzed is the idea here. Okay, so after all of this, back to verse 4. Uh, Jesus was passing through the village. A boy ran up against him and struck his shoulder, brushed past him, hit him in the shoulder. Jesus was angry and said to him, "You shall not go back the way you came." And immediately he fell down dead. And some who saw what had taken place said, "From where was this child begotten, that every word of his is certainly accomplished?" And the parents of the dead boy went away to Joseph and blamed him, saying, "Since you have such a child, it is impossible for you to live with us in the village, or else teach him to bless and not to curse, for he is killing our children." Um, so, I mean, we get sort of a lot of these kinds of stories. Jesus, like, harming people, boy Jesus harming people. Again, read through the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It doesn't check out with what we have about Jesus um, in the Gospels of the New Testament. The closest we would get is Jesus cursing the fig tree. Um, but I mean, you can imagine early Christians curious about what was Jesus doing in those years as a boy. I mean, think about the Gospel of Mark. Jesus appears on the scene in Mark chapter 1, verse 9. And the author, if this is the first gospel written, the author does not ever describe anything about Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, his age or what he looks like. Um, we have no idea. I mean, this could be a 20-year-old guy. This could be a 50-year-old guy. From the Gospel of Luke, we do get, a little more detail, something saying Jesus was about 30 years old, and then you can sort of count his trips to Jerusalem and 33 years when he dies. I'm not always sold on that. But there's a lot of room here for extra story. Just like, remember what John says at the end of his gospel. Not that John was giving an invitation for more gospel writing, but it seems that some people did take it that way. We get these really strange stories. So that's all for the infancy gospel of Thomas. Let's pull up now the uh, just regular gospel of Thomas. So not to be confused, there is an infancy gospel of Thomas and a gospel of Thomas. So the gospel of Thomas, this is a sayings gospel. It's mostly teaching material. So the introduction. These are the secret sayings which Jesus spoke and which Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote down. So the Gospel of Thomas, this one here, the author here or authors probably know the Synoptic Gospels. He might have the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew. There are bits in here that are from the four canonical Gospels. There's plenty as well that is not in the Gospels. So let's see some examples. Um, So here we get this in verse 20, something very similar, Mark chapter 4, I believe. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us what the kingdom of heaven is like." Jesus says, "Is like a mustard seed. It is the smallest of seeds, but when it falls on tilled soil, it becomes a great plant and produces shelter for birds of the sky." So this is essentially straight out of the canonical Gospels. There are a few of those in there. So when we think about, I remember our discussion of the synoptic problem, who's using who. Um, Mark is probably the first. Matthew and Luke both probably use Mark as a source. I think Luke probably uses Matthew as a source as well. John probably uses all four of them. It seems Thomas here is using um, uh, probably Matthew, or maybe more than one of the Synoptic Gospels. We do get a saying somewhere in here from the Sermon on the Mount. Here you go. If a blind man leads a blind man, they will both fall into a pit. Here we get from Mark 3, the Beelzebul controversy. It is not possible for anyone to enter the house of a strong man and take it by force unless he binds his hands. Then he will be able to ransack his house. It's not the exact wording, but it's pretty close to what we get in the Gospels. And if you read through this, I mean, you can see it is all sayings. This is all teachings. Jesus doesn't do anything in this Gospel. Here we get a little bit from the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. This follows the Lucan version. Remember in Matthew, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Luke just has, "Blessed are the poor." 53, this is interesting. Circumcision comes up a lot in Paul. Think of Galatians in particular. But here, in the Gospels, it basically never comes up. And that makes sense because Jesus is in Jewish territory. In his own words, he was sent to the sheep of the lost house of Israel. He's not doing a Gentile mission. That's sort of a post-resurrection thing, and Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. And so in the Gospels, we never get to hear what Jesus thinks about circumcision, which is kind of a bummer. I would love if, the Roman centurion at some point in the Gospels asks Jesus about proselyte circumcision or something. That would be so fascinating. But here in this Gospel of Thomas, we get one. His disciples said to him, "Is circumcision beneficial or not?" Jesus said to them, "If it were beneficial, their father would beget them already circumcised from their mother. Rather, the true circumcision in spirit has become completely profitable." So we get this sort of spiritualization of circumcision as an idea here, which is fascinating. I don't think that's the track that Paul takes in the New Testament. This maybe has some sort of more Gnostic and Platonic stuff going on. But yeah, check this out. I mean, just straight teaching sayings the entire way down. So finally, let us pull up the Gospel of Peter, and that'll be our last text that we look at together. All right, translated by Raymond Brown. Um, the Gospel of Peter. This one is fascinating. It is, as I said earlier, just as we have it, um, found in Egypt. All that our manuscript contains is a crucifixion and resurrection. It was probably originally written as a full gospel. It probably started with, a birth story or a baptism of Jesus, and is this fuller, longer gospel. But all we have is the end of it. We don't know for sure that it's a full gospel, but probably. Um, Eusebius, the early church historian, writes about the Gospel of Peter, and he writes about a bishop named Serapion, and there's a little bit of controversy in one of Serapion's churches. He's a bishop over multiple churches. He's overseeing things, making sure they're going well, and guarding good doctrine, doing all the bishop things. And there's a dispute in some of the churches about whether or not they should be reading the Gospel of Peter. And sort of some of the people are, worried that Peter didn't actually write this. So here we do get an authorship thing. I think Peter clearly did not write this, but they weren't so sure. And Eusebius tells a story about how Serapion gives his stamp of approval of the Gospel of Peter. He tells his churches, you know what, you can read this, it's fine. Um, Unfortunately, he said that without having read the text himself. Uh, Serapion did not read it. And as Eusebius tells the story, later Serapion does read the Gospel of Peter, or somebody tells him what's actually in it. And he retracts his permission. He says, "No, no way. This is not good. It has some Marcionite stuff in here. Remember the early church figure heretic Marcion. Um, and maybe he's referring there to something that we just don't have in our manuscript. It's not quite clear what Serapion was up in arms about. But at least the resurrection appearance is super weird. Um, One of the notable features of the Gospel of Peter is that the author follows in large part the synoptic version of the crucifixion story. There are some changes for sure. But instead of the Roman authorities being involved, it is all uh, Jews, Jews who are responsible for Jesus. It's only on the Jewish leaders. It sort of shifts that blame a little more intensely on Jews. So maybe some early anti-Semitism here. It's hard to say because we don't have the whole text, but it's something to think about. So let's look at some of this. Again, hopefully you've read this already. If not, pause and go to Canvas and read this text. All right. Well, one of the things that's interesting in Matthew and Mark in the New Testament, at the cross, Jesus dies, and his final words are the opening line of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Luke instead has Psalm 31, into your hands I commit my spirit. And John has his, it is finished bit. This one preserves the structure, at least, of Matthew and Mark. But instead of my God, it is my power, O power, you have forsaken me. It's a subtle change, but it is definitely a change. Here we have the Jews rejoicing as Jesus is dead, giving the body to Joseph of Arimathea. And then we get to some really interesting stuff. All right, verse 39. This is at the tomb, watching. The soldiers are watching what's going on at the tomb. And while they were relating what they had seen, again, they see three males who have come out from the sepulcher. Remember, sepulcher is it is a chamber like where the body is kept. They see two supporting the other one and the cross following them. So they see three people come out of the tomb. And this other one here is supposed to be Jesus. And here we see the reading records the cross is following them. So the cross is actually a figure in this text. Next, we get the head of the two reaching up to heaven, but the one being led out, this is Jesus in the text, led out by the hand, he was going beyond the heavens. So the Gospel of Peter here records this giant Jesus. His head extends all the way up to the heavens and beyond. So obviously a huge change from the Canonical Gospels. And then there's a question from heaven. Have you made proclamation to the fallen asleep, to those who are asleep? And an obeisance was heard from the cross. Yes. So actually here the cross is the one speaking, which again is very strange and bizarre. Here, have you made the proclamation to the fallen asleep? Think about 1 Peter and Jude. They have these little bits about Jesus going and proclaiming victory over or to the spirits in prison. Perhaps the Gospel of Peter is echoing that right here. And then we end up at the end of the story getting this bit about Levi, son of Alphaeus, whom the Lord ... and then our manuscript cuts off. So we don't have a sort of nice, clean ending to it. The manuscript ends. So we don't have the beginning, and we don't have the end, but we have this passion and resurrection narrative. So I just wanted to introduce these texts. They are interesting, and they help us to think about what some of the early Christians in the first, 2 to 3 to 4 centuries were thinking. In the big picture of history, they do fall very clearly on the side of non-canonical. We have the 4 that do count, and all others stand on the other side of that ledger, so that only 4 are authoritative scripture. But there's a good chance, you'll be confronted at some point people will tell you that there's these hidden gospels that the church removed from the Bible or something. And hopefully this helps you to be able to think and talk about these a little bit. That these, are fairly well known by scholars, um, and it's pretty clear why they're not included in the Bible. They're certainly forged accounts in the names of apostles trying to gain apostolic clout in order to push these stories. But hopefully you learned a little bit about the process historically, about how these texts came into being. Not everything is clear, but we have uncovered a good bit, and work is still being done on this. So maybe in 5 years this lecture will be outdated, and I would be happy for that. But all right, keep up with your reading. Hopefully everyone has a good week, and thanks for watching.